She packed the way she always packed, efficiently, without drama, rolling her shirts instead of folding them because she'd read somewhere that it prevented wrinkles. I watched her from the bedroom doorway. Light blue duffel bag, the one with the broken zipper pull she'd replaced with a key ring from a vacation we'd taken to Gatlinburg 6 years ago. She didn't look up. She was counting things silently, touching each item the way you do when you're making sure you haven't forgotten anything important. "Tamara says hi," she said, still not looking up. "Tell her I said hey." She zipped the bag, finally looked at me and smiled. It was a good smile. I want to be honest about that. It was warm and practiced, and it reached her eyes in the way it always had. And if I hadn't spent the last 17 years learning how to read the difference between a genuine expression and a performed one, I might have believed it entirely. She kissed me on the cheek. Her lip balm smelled like cherry. She'd been using the same kind since she was 32. "I'll text you when we get in," she said. "Drive safe." I stood at the front window and watched her back the Accord out of the driveway, watched the brake lights flicker at the end of the street, watched her turn right, which is not the direction of the interstate if you're heading to Nashville. Then I walked to the kitchen table, sat down, and opened my laptop. The GPS dashboard was already running. I'd tabbed it to the back behind my email, but I hadn't closed it. I never close it anymore. The little blue dot that represented her car moved east on Shelbyville Road, and I watched it for about 30 seconds. Then I looked away from the screen and stared at the salt shaker on the table. Ceramic. White. She'd bought it at a craft fair in Bardstown, and I'd teased her about paying $12 for a salt shaker when we had a perfectly good one at home already. I didn't look surprised. I looked tired. I want to tell you this story the way I would tell any other story from my professional life, because it's the only way I know how to tell it. I've been an insurance fraud investigator for going on 16 years. Before that, I was a claims adjuster. Before that, I was studying criminal justice at U of L on a partial scholarship and working nights at a UPS facility loading trucks, and I thought I wanted to be a police officer. And then I took an internship with a regional carrier and realized I had a specific talent for a specific kind of work, and I never left. The job is pattern recognition, fundamentally. It's sitting across from someone who is lying to you and listening very carefully. Not to the lie, but to the architecture around the lie. People who lie for money are almost never stupid. They've thought through the big stuff. It's the small stuff that gives them away. The claim that's just slightly too tidy. The timeline that works on paper but not in weather. The witness who uses the exact same three-word phrase as the claimant, verbatim, which tells you they rehearsed it together. I am patient in a way that people sometimes find unnerving. My supervisor, Karen, told me once that watching me work was like watching someone defuse a bomb by just sitting next to it for 3 weeks until it decided to give up on its own. I took that as a compliment. I can't help it. My professional instinct, the one that's been trained into me across hundreds of cases, is to gather, then document, then present, not in pieces, all at once. With no warning, you give someone the full picture before they've had a chance to build a defense, and they almost always come apart. I applied the same method here. I should tell you when I first noticed something. I've thought about this more than I'd like to admit. The honest answer is, I'm not entirely sure there was one single moment, because that's actually how it usually goes. It's not a thunderclap, it's a slow accumulation. But if I had to pick a date, the way I'd pick a date for a case file, I'd say it was a Saturday in early October. About 6 weeks before the night I'm describing to you with her backing out of the driveway. We were at a dinner party at our friends Carl and Debbie's house. Jess knows Debbie from the dental office. Debbie's one of the hygienists there. It was a small thing, 8 people, good food, the kind of evening where someone opens a second bottle of wine and the conversation gets relaxed and honest. At some point, Debbie was asking Jess about the Nashville trips. Jess had taken one in September, right before this, said it was a girls' weekend with Tamara. And Debbie said, "Oh, you always look so rested when you come back from those." And Jess laughed and said, "Tamara knows how to find the good hotels." And then she reached across the table and touched my arm. That touch. I've thought about that touch 100 times. It was too natural. It was the kind of casual, easy physical reassurance that a person extends to a partner when they want the partner to feel included in something, and there was absolutely nothing wrong with it on the surface. But I have spent my career watching people perform normalcy, and that touch had the quality of a performance. Not theatrical, subtle, almost perfect. I filed it, the way I file everything. Not in writing, not yet, just in the part of my brain that keeps a running ledger. Jess and I have been married for 14 years. We met when I was 29 and she was 26. She was managing the front desk at a dental office in St. Matthews, and I was a patient with a cracked molar and genuinely terrible dental anxiety. And she walked me through what was going to happen step by step in a voice so calm and matter of fact that I stopped being scared. I fell for her, I think, in that first conversation. Not because of how she looked, though she is, a genuinely beautiful woman, but because of the particular quality of her attention. She noticed things. She noticed that I kept glancing at the exit, and she moved so that she was between me and the door, without ever making it obvious that she'd done it on purpose. That's a particular kind of emotional intelligence, and I recognized it because I have a version of it myself. Though mine tends toward suspicion, and hers tends toward care. Or used to. We bought the house in the Highlands 9 years ago. We have no kids. We tried for 3 years and it didn't happen, and we grieved it, and arrived somewhere on the other side of that grief that was okay. Mostly okay, the way you can be okay with something that still has a weight to it. We have a cat named Roland, who is elderly and opinionated. We have a garden that Jess manages, and I help with badly. We have a routine that, if I'm being honest, had become comfortable in the way that old furniture is comfortable. You stop noticing it until you sit down somewhere else and remember what it felt like when things were new. I don't know exactly when things changed for her. That's the one thing I don't have documented. The internal timeline I can't access. What I can document is this. The first Nashville trip was September 9th through the 11th, a Friday through Sunday. Jess said she and Tamara were staying at the Kimpton Ayrton. She sent me a photo of a hotel room, king bed, gray linen, nice view. I remember looking at it and thinking it seemed expensive for what Tamara's budget typically allowed, but Tamara's ex-husband had settled with her the previous spring, and I assumed she was spending more freely now. I texted back a thumbs up emoji. That was the whole conversation. What I know now, because I obtained the records, is that on September 9th, a Craig Medlin checked into the Kimpton Ayrton in Nashville with one additional guest. Craig Medlin, age 37, who works as a personal trainer at the Evolve Fitness location on Bardstown Road, which is the gym where Jess has been a member since March of this year. His check-in was at 3:47 in the afternoon. The room was on the 9th floor. The same photo Jess sent me, the gray linen, the view, appears to have been taken from approximately the 9th floor, based on the visible skyline. I want to be clear about when I obtain these records, because the timing matters. I am not telling you this story in the order I lived it. I'm telling it in the order it became clear. Those are different things. I didn't know about Craig Medlin until 4 weeks after that October dinner party. I found him by accident and then by intention. In the methodical way I find everything. Here's what I did first. About 10 days after the dinner party, I set up the GPS tracker. I want to be transparent. I own a tracker. I own two of them, actually. They're standard tools for my work. Licensed. Logged in our company inventory. and I sometimes bring them home between assignments because storing personal equipment at the office requires a form, and I'm fundamentally lazy about forms. I placed one on Jess's car on a Tuesday morning while she was in the shower. Under the rear wheel well. Took about 45 seconds. I've done it 1,000 times in parking lots and shopping centers and once in a church parking lot, which I still feel a specific kind of bad about. I told myself I wasn't certain, that the tracker was just due diligence. That's what I tell myself in fraud cases too, that it's not a conclusion, it's a hypothesis being tested. The difference is that in fraud cases, I mean it. The GPS confirmed she was going where she said she was going for the first week and a half. Louisville to her office on the East End to the gym on Bardstown Road, gym to the Kroger or the Target or the dry cleaner to home. The geometry of a regular life. I watched the little blue dot follow its familiar paths and I thought, maybe I'm wrong. Maybe the dinner party touch was nothing. Maybe I'm doing what I sometimes do, which is apply professional paranoia to personal situations where it doesn't belong. And then on a Wednesday evening, she told me she was going to stay late at the office for a billing audit. And the GPS showed her car parked for 2 hours and 40 minutes at an address on Grinstead Drive that turned out to be a residential building with a parking lot adjacent to a park. I looked up the address. Nothing medically or professionally relevant. No dental suppliers, no equipment vendors, no office management associations, just an apartment building. I cross-referenced it with her gym's trainer roster the next morning. I used the gym's public website, which lists its trainers with photos and brief bios. Craig Medlin, personal trainer. Specialties include strength and conditioning and lifestyle coaching, and when I looked up his address in the property records database that my company licenses, which is available to me through my work login, his listed address was an apartment on Grinstead Drive. I sat with that for 3 days before I did anything else with it. There is a road we drove once, Jess and I, on a trip we took the year before we got married. We'd gone down to Mammoth Cave for a long weekend, and on the way back she fell asleep against my shoulder, somewhere around Elizabethtown, and I drove the rest of the way back to Louisville with her head on my shoulder, changing lanes carefully so she wouldn't wake up. And I remember that stretch of highway with the particular precision that the brain reserves for things it doesn't know, yet it will need to remember. The way the late afternoon light came sideways through the windshield and made everything golden for about 20 minutes. The way her breathing was so slow and even. The way I thought, this is it. This is what I want. This is the whole thing. I don't think about that memory often. I thought about it for 3 days straight after I found his address. On the 4th day, I was professional again. Over the following 2 weeks, using the GPS data, I built a preliminary timeline. The apartment on Grinstead appeared 7 times in a 30-day period. Visits ranged from 45 minutes to 3 hours and 12 minutes. On 2 occasions, Jess had told me she was going to the gym. On 1 occasion, she told me she had a work meeting. On 3 occasions, she offered no explanation at all for her whereabouts. She was simply gone for an errand-length block of time and returned without comment, and I didn't ask, because asking was not part of the method I'd chosen. The method I'd chosen was gather. I added a second layer. I requested access to our joint credit card through the app and exported the last 6 months of statements. This took about 4 minutes. It's something I could have done at any time. She knew I had access. It was a joint account, but I'd never particularly scrutinized it before because there was no reason to. Now I read through it the way I read through a claimant's financial records, which is carefully and without an agenda, just looking for anomalies. What I found in the credit card records was, on its own, explainable. 2 hotel stays in Nashville, both under Jess's name, both consistent with her stated girls' trips with Tamara. A few nice restaurant charges in Nashville, a spa charge. These were the kinds of transactions that a woman on a weekend trip with a friend would generate, and nothing about them individually raised a flag. It was only when I put them against the GPS data, when I noticed that the hotel charges from the second Nashville trip overlapped with a Friday when the GPS showed her car leaving Louisville at 11 in the morning, not mid-afternoon as she'd told me, that the architecture of the lie became visible. The car left at 11. She told me they weren't leaving until after her hair appointment, which was at 2. 3 hours and 12 minutes. That was the gap. I know what a gap like that means. It means someone adjusted a story to account for something they didn't expect to have to account for. A change in plans, an opportunity, a coordination with someone who had a different schedule than expected. Small gaps in logistics are where the real timeline lives. I still hadn't confirmed Craig Medlin directly. I had an address overlap, and a timeline inconsistency, and a suspicious apartment parking lot, and any one of these, in isolation, was circumstantial, and all three together were enough for me professionally, but I was not operating as a professional. I was operating as a husband, and I wanted to be sure in the way a husband needs to be sure, which is different from the way an investigator needs to be sure. So I called Tamara. I want to describe this carefully. I didn't call Tamara to confront her or to get her to confess anything. I called her about something completely real. Tamara's older brother, Marcus, has a home insurance claim that I'd helped him navigate 2 years prior, and it's the kind of thing that creates a standing excuse to touch base. I called under that pretext, chatted for about 4 minutes about nothing, and then mentioned casually that I wanted to send Jess something at the Nashville hotel. A small surprise for their trip the following weekend. And could she remind me which hotel they were staying at this time? Tamara paused. It was a short pause. Half a second, maybe less. But I've been listening for pauses in a professional capacity for 16 years, and this one had a specific texture. The texture of a person running a quick calculation about whether a small confirmation will cause a problem later. The Noel, I think, she said. Jess booked it. Let me double check with her before you do anything, though. You know how she is about surprises. That's fair, I said. I'll run it by her. Thanks, Tamara. She said sure and told me to say hello to Jess, and we hung up. I wrote down the exact exchange in a notes file I'd been keeping. Times, dates, verbatim dialogue where possible. A habit so old at this point I barely noticed doing it. Tamara was covering. She didn't know what I knew, so she didn't know how careful to be, and she wasn't careful enough. Her instinct was to confirm the Nashville story because that was the story she'd been asked to support. But she gave me the name of a hotel, which means she had some contact with Jess about logistics, which means she was a participant in the structure, not just a passive alibi. I noted that. Then I did something I've only ever done twice before in my career. I brought in outside help. There's a PI I use on complicated cases, a woman named Sandra Okafor, who runs a 2-person operation out of an office near the University of Louisville. She's licensed, meticulous, and more importantly, she's court admissible. Her methodology is airtight. I've testified alongside her documentation twice, and both times it held without challenge. I called her on a Thursday morning and told her I had a domestic case and gave her the minimum necessary context. She didn't ask for more. She set her rate and I agreed to it, and that was that. I want to be very clear about why I hired Sandra. It wasn't because I needed confirmation. I already had confirmation. In the same way I have confirmation in every fraud case before I close it. Not proof beyond a reasonable doubt in the legal sense, not yet, but the investigator's certainty, the point at which the question is no longer whether but how much and how long. I hired Sandra because I had already decided what I was going to do about this. And what I was going to do about this required documentation that was obtained by a licensed professional, under a clear chain of custody, documented in a format that would hold up in divorce proceedings. because I had already decided there would be divorce proceedings. I made that decision on the drive home from work on a Tuesday. Traffic was bad on I-64. I was listening to the radio. A song came on. Nothing significant. I don't even remember what it was. And I thought, very clearly and without drama, this is done. Not with anger, with the flat certainty of a diagnosis you've been half expecting. I drove the rest of the way home, helped Roland off the counter where he wasn't supposed to be, and made dinner. And Jess came home and we ate together and talked about her day, and I listened to her with my full attention, the way I always do, and I felt nothing extraordinary. Which frightened me later when I was brushing my teeth and looked at myself in the mirror and thought, you should feel something more than this right now. But I didn't know yet about the money. The money came later, and the money changed things. 2 weeks before the night I'm describing, the night she kissed me on the cheek and told me Tamara said hi, I decided to look at the full financial picture. Not just the credit card, everything. We have a joint checking account, a joint savings account, a joint investment account I mostly ignore, and a joint credit card. I also have an individual IRA, and I knew she'd opened a Roth IRA in her own name a few years ago, which I'd encouraged and she'd handled independently. Standard stuff. Married people can have individual accounts. There was nothing suspicious about the Roth. What I found was not the Roth. Our joint savings account had a current balance of roughly $41,000. That was about right in the general sense. We'd been keeping it around $60,000 for the past 2 years, building toward a kitchen renovation we'd discussed but never committed to. We'd also used about $15,000 of it in the spring for a new HVAC system, so $41,000 felt approximately correct, except when I pulled the full statement history, which I did by logging into the bank's portal with our joint login, which I was fully authorized to do, and looked at the individual transfers. I found a recurring pattern. Monthly transfers, always on or around the 12th of each month, always to an external account. 6 of them going back to the previous May, which was 5 months ago now. The amounts varied slightly. $3,400, $3,800, $4,100, $3,900, $4,200, $3,600. I added them on a notepad. $23,000. $23,000 transferred to an account I didn't recognize from our joint savings over 5 months. The external account number appeared as a partial string in the transfer records. I couldn't identify the institution from the number alone, but the routing prefix is something I know from years of financial documentation work, and it resolved to a regional credit union, one that has branches in Louisville and southern Indiana. A credit union where Jess could have easily opened an individual account with just her own identification. I sat back in my chair and I did a thing I almost never do, which is I laughed. Not a funny laugh. A short, involuntary sound that was more like the body's pressure valve releasing. Because what I recognized, what hit me with the specific, almost aesthetic precision of professional pattern recognition, was that this was a pre-exit account. This was money being staged, not stolen in a reckless way. Moved in amounts carefully calibrated to avoid looking unusual in month-to-month fluctuation. This was the financial architecture of someone who was planning to leave and making sure they wouldn't be starting from zero when they did. I've seen this pattern in insurance fraud cases. Not often, but a few times. Spouses who are party to a fraudulent claim, siphoning settlement funds before a divorce. The method is almost always the same. Consistent amounts. Long enough between transfers to avoid a pattern that sets off bank monitoring, just plausible enough to ignore if you weren't looking. It's not clever, in the technical sense. It just relies on the other person not looking. She did not know that I look at everything. That's been true for 16 years, and I'd never had reason to look at her. Now I had reason. For a few hours that night, longer than I want to admit. I was not an investigator. I was a 43-year-old man sitting alone in his kitchen at 11 at night, looking at 6 lines of bank transfer records and feeling something I can only describe as the particular sick vertigo of realizing that a plan exists that doesn't include you. That someone who sleeps in your bed and uses your bathroom and makes coffee in your kitchen in the morning has, for 5 months, been quietly dismantling the shared structure of your life without telling you. The affair I had processed. Processed is maybe a strange word, but it's the right one. I had received the information about the affair, and it had registered as a wound, as loss, as grief, and I had contained it within the methodology because the methodology is how I function. The money was different. The money required a different response, not emotionally, but practically and legally. And identifying that distinction, parsing it clearly, was the thing that pulled me back from the place I was in at 11 o'clock in that kitchen. This was no longer only a matter of betrayal. This was a matter of record. I called Sandra the next morning and added to the brief. I told her I also needed documentation of financial activity, that I had identified the external account and would send her the partial routing information, and that I needed whatever she could obtain through legitimate license channels to confirm the account holder and transaction history. She said she'd see what her financial contact could put together. I told her the timeline was approximately 2 weeks. Sandra delivered on day 11. The package she sent me was thorough in the way her work always is. Time-stamped photographs from the Nashville trip Jess had taken 2 weekends prior, showing Jess and Craig Medlin at a restaurant, walking together, entering the hotel. Hotel check-in records confirming the same guest registration pattern as the September trip. A cell tower location analysis for Jess's phone number, obtained through legal channels, documented accordingly, confirming her presence in Nashville on the dates in question and absence from Louisville. And for the financial piece, confirmation of an account at the credit union held in Jess's name alone, opened in April of this year, with a current balance of $23,740. $23,740. The extra $740 was interest. She'd been diligent enough to put it in a savings account, not checking. I spent 2 evenings putting together the full package. I've prepared case files for presentation more times than I can count, but I've never done it at my own kitchen table, alone, with Roland sitting on the chair across from me, watching me the way cats watch things that are going to change. I printed everything. I organized it chronologically, then by category: GPS logs, hotel records, photographic evidence from Sandra, cell tower analysis, bank transfer records, the external account documentation. I wrote a summary memo at the front of the file. 1 page, bullet points, dates and amounts, the way I'd write it for a supervisor. I kept the language flat and factual. This is what happened. This is the documentation. This is the amount. At the bottom of the summary memo, I wrote 4 words. Your claim has been denied. I put everything in a manila envelope, the kind I use for case delivery. 10 by 13, clasp closure, our home address in the return position, no postage required because I was going to leave it at the house for her. I sealed it and wrote her name on the front in my normal handwriting, which is small and neat and unremarkable, and I set it on the kitchen counter. Then I booked a hotel room. I chose a Hampton Inn about 4 miles from the house. Nothing dramatic, comfortable, functional. A room with a small desk and a window that faced a parking lot. I called it 2 days in advance, paid for 3 nights with my personal credit card, and on the morning of the day she was packing the blue duffel bag with the keyring zipper pull, I loaded a bag of my own. Just clothes, toiletries, my laptop, the novel I'd been failing to read for 3 months, and put it in my car before she woke up. She didn't know it was there. I drove to work, came home at my regular time, cooked dinner, watched television beside her on the couch, with Roland between us, and went to bed. The next day was Friday. She packed the blue bag. She kissed me on the cheek. She said, "Tamara says hi." I said, "Tell her I said hey." I watched the GPS dot move east on Shelbyville Road instead of south toward the interstate. I let it run for about an hour. Then I closed the laptop, picked up the manila envelope from where I'd placed it on the counter that morning, and left it on the kitchen table with a single, sticky note on top that said, in the same small, neat handwriting, Jess. No message other than the name. She'd know it was for her. She'd know when she saw the manila envelope and the return address, our own address, that something specific was happening. Because you don't put a manila envelope on your wife's kitchen table without intent. I picked up my bag from the car. I drove to the Hampton Inn. I checked in. The woman at the desk asked if I was in town for business, and I said something like that. Yeah, and she gave me the key card, and I rode the elevator to the third floor and opened the room and sat on the end of the bed and looked at the television, which was off. I was hungry. I hadn't eaten since noon. I went to the vending machine down the hall and got a bag of pretzels and a bottle of water and came back to the room and ate the pretzels sitting at the small desk by the window and looked out at the parking lot. A couple was loading suitcases into an SUV 2 rows over. They were arguing about something, not seriously. One of them laughed at one point. I watched them until they finished and drove away. My phone was on. I had it face up on the desk next to the pretzels. Jess texted at 7:43 that evening. I know the time because I have the messages saved. The text said, "Just got to the hotel. Long drive, lol. How was your day?" I didn't respond. At 9:12, she texted again. "Hope you had a good day. Miss you." I didn't respond. At 10:47, she texted, "Going to bed early? Talk tomorrow. Love you." I turned off the light and lay in the dark and thought about whether "miss you" and "love you" were habit or something else, and I didn't come to a conclusion, and eventually I fell asleep. The next morning was Saturday. She always came home from the Nashville trips on Sunday, so I had the full day. I went to a diner and had breakfast and read the local paper, which I never do anymore because I read everything on my phone, but there was a copy sitting on the counter, and I picked it up and read it slowly the way I used to read newspapers, cover to cover, including the sections about high school sports and city council meetings that have nothing to do with my life. It felt like a deliberate act of normalcy, a way of saying to no one in particular, "I am fine. I am a person having breakfast and reading a paper. I am fine." She found the envelope sometime Saturday afternoon, based on when she called. I know she found it Saturday afternoon because Sandra had been watching the house. I'd asked her to, as a formality, just to document the timeline. And Sandra texted me at 2:17 to say that Jess's car had pulled into the driveway at 2:09, which confirmed what I already expected. She hadn't been in Nashville. She'd been somewhere in Louisville or nearby, and when I didn't respond to her texts, when the silence of a non-response accumulated, she'd come home. People who are managing a deception are extremely sensitive to disruption in the expected pattern. My not responding was a disruption. She walked into the house. She found the envelope. My phone rang at 3:02 p.m. I was sitting in the hotel room. I'd been back for about an hour after a slow walk around a nearby park. I was at the desk again. The pretzels were gone, but the water was still there. I looked at her name on the screen for 2 rings, and then I picked up. Dean. Her voice was, "I want to get this right because it matters. Not what I expected. I've delivered bad news to people in a professional capacity more times than I can count, and there's a standard sequence. Denial, then anger, then calculation, in roughly that order. What I heard in that one word, my own name, was none of those things. It was panic. Clean, genuine panic. the kind that doesn't have room for performance inside it. "Hey," I said, "where are you?" "At a hotel." A pause. Then, "How long have you known?" That surprised me. Not the question. The question was logical, the natural first question, but the directness of it. No detour through denial. No, this isn't what it looks like. No, how dare you invade my privacy. She went straight to the center of it, and that told me something about her, something I filed away even in that moment, which is that whatever she'd built with Craig Medlin was real enough to her that she wasn't going to insult either of us by pretending it wasn't there. "A while," I said. "How long is a while?" "About 6 weeks of documentation. Longer than that of knowing." Another pause. I could hear her breathing, then, "The envelope is Dean, this is. This is court formatted. This is like a legal filing. It's structured the same way I structure them at work, yes. Why did you, why would you do it like this?" "Because it's the way I know how to do things, Jess." "I don't mean the format." Her voice cracked slightly on format. "I mean, why would you mail me a, why didn't you just talk to me? Why didn't you come to me when you first, if you knew, why didn't you say something?" I'd thought about how I would answer this question. I'd thought about it more than I'd thought about almost anything else in the past 6 weeks, lying in the dark while she slept next to me, driving to work, eating the pretzels in the hotel room the night before. I had a version of an answer that was professional and measured and entirely true, which was that I needed the documentation to be complete before any confrontation, because confrontation without documentation allows the other party to control the narrative. That was true. It was also not the whole truth. Because once I said it out loud, I said, it was over. And I wasn't, I stopped. "You weren't what?" "I needed time." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said quietly, "The money." "Yes." "Dean, I can explain." "You don't have to explain it to me," I said. "The documentation explains it, but you should explain it to a lawyer, because that account is going to be part of the proceedings." "Proceedings." Her voice went up slightly on the word. "You're already Jess." I said her name the way you say something when you need to slow a conversation down. "I'm not doing this on the phone." "Then come home. Come home and we can talk about this face to face. We can—" "There's nothing to talk about that isn't already in the envelope." "That's not true. There are things that aren't in an envelope. There are. Dean, 15 years. We have 15 years. You can't just mail me a piece of paper and check into a hotel and call it done." 14 years, I said automatically, the way you correct a number when a number is wrong. "We've been married 14 years. She made a sound that I can only describe as the kind of sound a person makes when something hits them in a way they weren't ready for. Something small in the middle of something enormous. She said, 14. Right, right. 14. I closed my eyes. "I'm not trying to punish you," I said after a moment. "I want you to know that. The format of the envelope, the documentation, that's not punishment. That's just me not knowing another way. That's—" She stopped. When she came back, she was crying, not loudly, in that way she cries where you can mostly hear it in the pauses between words. "Dean, I'm sorry. I need you to know I'm sorry. Not because of the envelope, not because of what's in it, but because you had to sit with this alone for 6 weeks. I know what that must have been like for you. I know what you do with things when you're alone with them." I sat with that for a moment. Here is what I know about Jess. She has always been able to find the nerve ending, the specific tender place. Not cruelly, just accurately. It's the same quality that walked me through a dental procedure without fear when I was 29. The ability to locate exactly what is happening inside another person and speak to it directly. Even now, even in this moment that she had constructed and I had documented and that was ending the way it was ending, she had put her finger on the exact thing. You had to sit with it alone. And I know what you do with things when you're alone with them. What I do with things when I'm alone with them is I process them into evidence. I make them into a case. I build a structure around the wound so that the wound can be contained and examined rather than simply felt. I've known this about myself for most of my adult life, and I've mostly thought of it as functional, as a form of competence, as the thing that makes me good at my job and steady in a crisis. Sitting in that hotel room, with the parking lot outside and the TV off and my wife crying on the other end of the phone, I considered the other possibility, that it was not strength, that it was something I'd built a long time ago in response to something I never talked about, and that I'd mistaken the absence of collapse for the presence of resilience, and that there is a meaningful difference between those two things. I thought about all the nights in the past 6 weeks when I lay next to her and knew, and I thought about how not once in those 6 weeks had I cried, and I thought about whether that was because I had things under control or because something in me was very deeply and quietly broken in a way I didn't have a name for yet. "Jess," I said. "Yeah," I said the one thing I had not planned to say. The one thing I had not written in any notes file or documented in any case record or rehearsed in any version of this conversation that I'd run through my head in the hotel parking lot or the diner over the paper or the dark bedroom while she breathed slowly beside me. I said it quietly, in the same soft way I say most things, but without the professional remove, without the methodology, without any of the architecture I'd spent 16 years building around the part of me that still feels things the way people are supposed to feel them. I said, "I would have stayed." She didn't say anything. "Whatever was wrong," I said. "If you had told me, I would have stayed and tried to fix it. I want you to know that, not for the record, just for you." I hung up. The room was very quiet. I set the phone down on the desk and looked at it for a minute, the way you look at something you've just used for its last purpose. Outside the window, the parking lot was gray and still in the late afternoon light. A plastic bag moved across the asphalt in a wind I couldn't feel from where I was sitting. I watched it catch on the wheel of a parked car and stop. I got up and went to the minibar, looked at it. The little bottles of bourbon and the can of Heineken and the overpriced water and the chocolate bar. Looked at all of it for a long moment. Then I closed the minibar and stood up and ran my hand over my face and stood there in the middle of the hotel room for a second, not doing anything. I sat back down on the edge of the bed. I reached into the back pocket of my jeans, where I keep my wallet, and I took the wallet out and held it for a moment. It's an old wallet. Brown leather, worn down at the fold, a wallet that Jess had noted was embarrassingly dilapidated about 2 years ago and had offered to replace. I'd told her I was attached to it. That wasn't entirely true. I just never got around to it because I'm bad at replacing things that still technically function. In the innermost card sleeve of the wallet, behind a gas station loyalty card I never use, and a folded slip of paper with an address I'd written down and never needed to throw away, there is a photograph. Not a digital photograph. An actual printed photograph, the kind that comes out of a cardboard envelope from a drugstore, soft at the edges now, slightly faded along the left side where it once got damp. Two people standing in front of a house in the winter, with snow on the ground, dressed for cold, both of them squinting slightly in the low light as if the picture was taken later in the day than was ideal. The man's arm is around the woman's shoulders. They're both smiling in the unselfconscious way people smiled in photographs before photographs became a performance. My parents, their 40th anniversary. My father died 11 months after that picture was taken. Cardiac event, fast, the kind that doesn't give you time to prepare. My mother is still alive, still in the house in New Albany. Still calls me every Sunday at 7 p.m., whether or not I remember to call first. They were married for 41 years. I don't know why I've carried that photograph for as long as I have. I've thought about it, and the best I can do is say that it represents something I believed was possible, that the long thing was achievable, that if you stayed and worked and paid attention and showed up, there was a version of two people in late winter squinting at a camera that you could arrive at eventually. I know that's not guaranteed. I know it takes both people. I know I'm not my father and Jess is not my mother, and 41 years is just a number without the substance of the thing itself. I know all of that. I looked at the photograph for a while. Then I put it back. I put the wallet back in my pocket. I shifted back on the bed so my back was against the headboard, and I stretched my legs out, and I looked at the ceiling, which was the standard hotel room ceiling. Textured white, a smoke detector in the center with a single red blinking light, a rectangular vent along one edge. Not remarkable in any way. The ceiling of a room that exists only to be passed through. I stared at it for a long time. Long enough that the light outside the window changed from the gray of late afternoon to the darker gray of early evening without my noticing the transition. The room was warm and quiet. I didn't turn the television on. I didn't pick the phone back up. I just lay there, eyes open, looking at the ceiling, and I let myself be somewhere between the investigator and the person, somewhere in the middle where the case was closed and the grief hadn't organized itself into anything yet, where it was still just the raw fact of the thing. 14 years, a house in the Highlands, a garden, an elderly cat, a blue duffel bag with a key ring zipper pull, a photograph from a craft fair in Bardstown, the way she fell asleep against my shoulder somewhere around Elizabethtown, and I drove the whole rest of the way without moving. I would have stayed. That was the truest thing I knew. It wasn't enough, and it was the truest thing I knew, and I let those two facts sit next to each other in the quiet of the room without trying to make them cohere. I had spent 6 weeks building a case, and the case was complete, and the case did not explain anything, really. Not the way I needed things explained, not the deep interior reason, the moment when the math of a marriage stopped working for her. And I was starting to understand, lying there on that hotel bed with the red light blinking in the smoke detector, that some things do not resolve into documentation. Some things remain open. Some questions generate findings that answer the measurable question and leave the real question entirely untouched. Why? I don't have a file for why. I lay there for a long time, looking at the ceiling, not sleeping and not moving and not turning on the television. At some point, Roland would be alone at the house, wondering where I was, sitting in the kitchen looking at his bowl with the particular long-suffering patience of a cat who has opinions about feeding schedules. At some point, there would be lawyers and paperwork and the procedural machinery of ending something that had taken 14 years to build. At some point, I would have to go back and live in the house, or not live in the house, and figure out which things were mine and which were ours, and what to do with the garden she managed and I helped with badly. At some point, all of that. But not right now. Right now, I was just a man in a hotel room, 43 years old, in a city I'd lived in my whole life, lying on a bed in the gathering dark with the parking lot outside and the smoke detector blinking its small red pulse. And if there was something on the other side of this, some future version of myself moving through a life that looked different and perhaps okay, I couldn't see it yet, and I wasn't going to pretend otherwise. The thing about working fraud for 16 years is that you lose your tolerance for pretending. You see enough performed normalcy that the real thing, even when it's painful, becomes the only thing worth having. So I didn't pretend. I just looked at the ceiling, and I was quiet.